Thank you for your leadership in that. You know that story of Punchinello. Like I said, it's a story I was introduced to at a fairly young age. But it's amazing how some stories stick with you. Yeah, and I know for me, just that idea of, hey, am I craving the stars? Or am I loathing the spots? And how easily these labels can stick to us because we live in a world that loves giving out labels. And coming back to that core of going, hey, how much of my life is defined by the labels that either I have placed on myself or that other people have placed on me is the kind of question that we need to regularly consider. You know, we've been going through this flipped series. This is week number 3, and we're talking in this series about these moments where people encountered Jesus, and suddenly their response was like, "Wow, that changes everything." Like, that changes everything. We spoke about Zacchaeus, this man who was derided from his society, and suddenly Jesus sees him and accepts him and wants to spend time with him. Suddenly for him, it's like that changed everything. Last week, Megan spoke about the Roman centurion and this idea of speaking with authority. Again, the Romans, the oppressors, why would Jesus engage with them, let alone the fact that Jesus then healed from a distance? It's like, is there anyone that we are missing or dismissing? Are there any ways of God that He is wanting to work that we are missing or dismissing? Because it may just be that those who think they're in are out, and those who are out are in fact in. And this is again what Jesus challenged the people of the day with and challenged us with today, as we have our minds sometimes flipped from the assumptions that we carry. And certainly the question of labels is something that we need to be flipped on a regular basis. I don't know if you think about this very often. I suppose for a lot of my years, I've worked with young people, worked with teenagers, and this idea of labels is very, very relevant, right? It almost feels explicit. Maybe they're within a school environment where it feels like these labels are expressed very explicitly, right? But certainly it doesn't change when we grow up, right? It doesn't change when we grow up. We perhaps just become a little bit more somewhat immune at a kind of external level, but certainly the inner kind of level, it continues to work on us, because the truth is our labels are constantly being created and critiqued. I mean, think about it. We create labels by the roles that we play within our workplace or our school or our family. We might have this label as a leader or as someone who is creative or as someone who is strong. Sometimes it's by nature of a vocation. You're a doctor or you're a teacher or you're a pastor or you're a parent. And we have this kind of label that gets attached to ourselves. Sometimes our labels are created by what people say about us. Oh, that person's funny. That person's nice. That person is loud. That person is valuable. Or that person, they're frustrating. And the label lands on us. Sometimes we create labels by the ways that we interpret our experiences. We go through a particular experience, whether it be a good one or a bad one, and suddenly we have this label: I am a success, or I am a failure. I'm a winner, I'm a loser. And so it's not like we have one label, right, that just kind of keeps getting repeated over. We end up with all these labels all over us, right? Our mind and our heart, and everywhere we're just covered in these labels that are created by us or from others around us. And the truth is, these labels that we give ourselves, for starters, can cause some really significant inner conflict within us. You know, in our minds sometimes we define ourselves a certain way to only discover we don't meet that definition. So suddenly we've got this label of I'm a success because of some previous experience, but then we tried really hard and we didn't make it. So suddenly we start questioning that label that we gave ourselves. Maybe you were always the funny person, but you told a joke and nobody laughed. And suddenly you're starting to question whether or not that label is legitimate. Maybe you bombed at a work project in your strongest area. I was always going to be able to deliver on that, but suddenly you just bombed it, right? And suddenly you get this inner conflict within you because the label, right, doesn't match the reality. Like I said, our labels are constantly being created, but also critiqued. Inner conflict. You know, and the labels that we receive from others can also cause significant inner conflict. You know, and so what might happen is that people choose to define us a certain way, they'll give us a certain label, and then we don't know whether or not to push against it or to embrace it. This is what causes the inner conflict, right? Because some labels were like, if I embrace that, then I'll be accepted, yeah? I'll find acceptance, I'll find community in that label. But then the other part of us goes, but that label doesn't actually define me, or it doesn't fully capture who I am, and so we want to push against it. So again, we find ourselves in this space where we're like, I kind of want it, but I also don't want it. And we end up with this inner turmoil, both by the labels that we create for ourselves, but also the labels that others give us. You see, we might not like people labeling us, but the truth is, at the same time, we are constantly labeling other people. When we think about the Wimmick situation, all they did was go around and give each other stars and dots. And I don't know if that resonated with you, and I'm like, yeah, well, that's right, isn't it? We are the Wimmicks. We go around giving each other stars and dots. This is what media does. This is what we do interpersonally. We give each other stars and dots. And even though we may not like it for ourselves, it doesn't stop us doing it toward others. Because sometimes these labels are given with no thought at all. But we all know that the effects of labels are serious and they're powerful. Because sometimes, and you may even resonate with this, it would surprise me if you didn't, sometimes the labels that you have been given have made you feel sad or stupid or insignificant or hurt or angry. Many of you here may have spent many unhappy months, perhaps even years, because of a label that has been placed on you or that you have placed upon yourself. You haven't tried to do things because of your label. No, I am this type of person, so I won't engage in that space. It's too scary. Maybe it is that you put on an act because of your label. People see me this way, so I'm just going to play into that act. And yet you know, deep inside, that it's just a mask. And this is all really heartbreaking, isn't it? This is heartbreaking that it affects us this way, because the labels that people create for you aren't always true. And yet we're affected by them and we go, well, like, this is shaping my life, it is orientating my life, and yet it isn't actually true a lot of the time. But that also challenges us, because that means that the labels we create for other people aren't always true either. So we know that labels are a big deal. So what do we do with them? Who has the right to label us, and do we have the right to label other people? And today we're going to look at the story of someone who had one of the worst possible labels for her time. And that's of what would be classically known as a bleeding woman, which is a label in and of itself, isn't it? But if you have your Bible, I encourage you to turn with me to Mark chapter 5. We're going to be starting at verse 24b, and it will also be on the screen. But as I always say, follow along in your Bible, because it may be that God draws something to your attention, and that might be the word for you. Sorry, I said Mark. I meant Luke. Apologies. Sorry, no, it is Mark. I've got Luke up there. It is actually Mark. I put the wrong... It is actually in Luke as well. This is why I've got confused. The story's in Luke and Mark, but when it says Luke up there, it's actually Mark. Apologies. Mark 5, 24b to 26. So this is a bit of the context. A large crowd followed and pressed against him, that is Jesus. Okay? And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all that she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. Now, the where of this story is that Jesus is actually on his way to do another healing, right? And so the crowds are pressing around him. They're all around him. This is a tight kind of group of people. And on his way, we meet this woman. This woman is introduced to us. And so this woman, as it's described, has been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had this illness that essentially caused her to get one of the most uncomfortable labels in her society, and that was unclean. This bleeding for 12 years, it meant that she was labeled unclean. And note that this isn't just about a moment. We're talking 12 years. Okay, so this isn't like a temporary label, oh, you're bleeding the other day, let's not get around you. 12 years this woman has had this label, and not only has she had this label, she has attempted, right, to get healed. You can see she has suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, and she'd spent all that she had. So this wasn't a woman who was just kind of resigned to her state. This was a woman who deeply wanted to escape this label, who wanted to escape this status. And yet, trying to escape this status, she actually developed even more labels. Not only was she unclean, she was also now unhealable, right? Because all the doctors couldn't do anything. And she was also destitute because she had no money. So in her attempt to actually remove herself from this label, she actually generated more labels. And these weren't just a label for the moment, for the month, for the year. This was a label for life. You are unclean. And because it involved bleeding especially, you have to understand that particularly in the day, this was a state of ritual impurity, right? So the holy people weren't allowed to touch the blood, right? So it was a state of perpetual impurity. There was no escaping this cycle for her. And yet what we see is in her desperation, this prompted something quite incredible. I don't know if you've had a label that you've held on to a really long time and you've tried to escape it. Maybe if you have, you can resonate with this woman maybe in some small way. You try and try and try to escape that label. You try and try to escape that story or that history, and yet it feels hopeless. It feels like the same label just keeps on getting perpetuated. Or maybe you'll resonate with this woman, but maybe it just may be that her actions have something to encourage you with. Because notice what happens next. This is Mark 5, when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Now, interesting, note some details here. She'd heard about Jesus. She'd heard about Jesus. So this messaging about this Jesus person was kind of going out throughout the crowds. His movement, his kingdom, what he was doing, who he was being, was kind of perpetuating out there, and she'd heard about Jesus. I mean, she would have been on the outside, and yet she still heard about this man, perhaps something more than a man. And she knew her labels. She knew how everyone else saw her. She knew that she had no place in society, and yet she was convinced by what she heard that he was somehow different. That Jesus was somehow different from the labels that she had on herself and from the way that society had labeled her. And so what we see here is incredible courage from this woman. Incredible courage from a woman who had been labeled for life to kind of come up from behind him and approach this Jesus who must be someone different to what the rest of society and the rest of people treat me as. And you can tell that it's still very tentative, right? Because she came up behind him. She didn't stand up in front of him and, hey, Jesus, look at me. It was pressed crowd, dense people coming up and just sneaking up behind him to grab the edge of his clothes. Now, to understand exactly what's going on here, I need to talk about something called tzitzi. Tzitzi. This is a Hebrew word. Because to understand why she was going to try and grab the edge of his cloak is pretty much misunderstood from our perspective, but was deeply meaningful for the day. Now, tzitzi, as it's pronounced, it looks like tzitzit, but it's tzitzi, actually first appears in Numbers chapter 15 when God says to Moses this: throughout the generations to come, you are to make tassels, or tzitzi, on the corners, kanaf, Hebrew word, of your garments, with a blue cord on each tassel, tzitzi. You will have these tassels, tzitzi, to look at, and so you will remember all the commands of the Lord, so that you may obey them and not prostitute yourselves by chasing after the lusts of your own hearts and eyes. Then you will remember to obey all my commandments. So all the way back here in Numbers, God instructs the people to attach these tassels to the corners of their garments, to attach the tzitzi to the kanaf of their garment, so that they will be visually reminded of God's provision, right? And visually reminded to live his way rather than go after lusts of their heart, right? So even today, many Jews, many faithful Jewish people wear what's called a prayer shawl, okay, to obey this text. And the tzitzi, that is the tassels, right, are there on the corners of these prayer shawls, and they are considered to be the holiest part of the prayer shawl. Now, interestingly, this idea of the prayer shawl and the corners of the prayer shawl are found throughout the Bible in other ways. I don't know if you've been familiar with the story of David and Saul, and when David goes to hide in a cave and Saul comes to, relieve himself, and he cuts off the corner, the kanaf, right, of his robe. And so it's actually this reference to this idea of the prayer shawl. Rather than killing him, he kind of cuts it off in 1 Samuel chapter 24. Even when Jesus talks about the idea of going into your prayer closet, don't do all your parading of your prayer in public, but actually go into your prayer closet, we often translate it at. It's actually a reference to putting the prayer shawl, right, over your head and over your arms in Matthew chapter 6. And so again, this is like a foreign kind of concept to us, but deeply, deeply connected to the first century and the ideas that people had around God's instruction and the need, right, to have these tzitzit on the corners, the kanaf, of their garments. Now, over time, as people participated in this, one of the most significant ways that this tzitzit is referenced is in the prophet Malachi, prediction about the coming Messiah. He says here in Malachi 4 verses 2, "But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in his wings." Healing in his wings. And that is the word kanaf, which is that word for corner. That's right, where the tzitzit is attached, right? So all the way back then, there were these kind of messianic prophecies, this idea that somehow in the tzitzit, right there in the corner, there was the power to heal. And it's understandable that we miss this. I mean, even in the translation of the NIV, this word wings is translated rays because it connects with this idea of sun. So again, very, very hidden if you're not quite sure what's going on there, yeah? But you can understand that these stories that have been perpetuated, this coming Messiah is coming who will have the power to heal. And I've heard about this Jesus person who is treating people differently and seeing people differently and touching the unclean and is able to bring about healing in ways that no one else has been able to do. If he's the Messiah, then where is the healing going to be found? Well, if only I could touch the edges of his cloak. If only I could touch the edges of his prayer shawl. If only I could touch the corner of the tzitzit, then maybe that healing would occur. And so when the woman grabs the edges of his cloak or his prayer shawl, because Jesus, after all, was a Jewish rabbi and would have been wearing one, she is demonstrating that she actually believes that Jesus is the Messiah and that his tassels have healing power. So that's what's going on here. She's got these labels for life. And there she is with whatever courage she can muster, knowing how everyone else sees her. She creeps up behind Jesus, not even to speak to him, but just to touch his tassels, to touch the tzitzit, in the hope that she would be healed, in the hope that she would experience something of his messiahship. Doesn't that just blow your mind? Doesn't that just open the story up in a profound way? I don't know, it does for me. Because I just see this woman and just the desperation. I don't even need to be named. I don't even need to be seen. I just need the opportunity to touch the corner, to participate in the promise of God that has been there from the beginning. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that the power had gone out for him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" And so in this moment of incredible faith, we see this kind of mutual recognition of what took place. The woman felt in her body, it's like, whoa, something just happened. I'm healed. And Jesus himself felt the power go from out of him. See, this woman had reached out and touched his tassels. She had faith in the promises of God, and she was healed, just as Malachi said that she would. But again, there is something bigger that's going on here than just the physical healing, which brings us back to the labels. Notice what the disciples say after this has occurred. Jesus is like, "Hey, who touched me?" And the disciples say, "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" So the disciples are like, "Jesus, come on, mate. Like, Do you not see where you are, right? Everyone's crowding around you. There's all this touching going on, right? There's all this touching. Do you think there were other people who touched his seat seat? Probably. They're all crowding around, and yet Jesus knew that something profound had just taken place. The disciples were like, let's just move on. Dude, that's a stupid question. Like, let's move on. But Jesus was like, no. Something significant happened. This wasn't just about anybody kind of getting up. Something significant had happened, and Jesus felt it, and so he stopped. He stopped. He started to look around. He started to look around. Look what it says in the next verse. But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. So the disciples just want to move on. They just want to be like, hey, that's just a ridiculous question. Nothing happened. Let's just move on. But Jesus actually stopped and kept looking around. That word kept there. He just kept looking around. Something happened. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." So again, this is a profound story about healing. And we could talk about healing and the fact that Jesus heals, and that's an exciting thing, and the sign of that, and we could talk about that, but there's actually something beyond the physical healing going on here, right? Jesus, so significant that Jesus needs to stop, not just move on. And so we have this woman who comes forward in fear, bringing the honest testimony of what took place. And what does Jesus say to her? He says, in light of this, even in light of how you're feeling right now, even in light of your history, in light of what took place, daughter, your faith has healed you. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. And so in 2 sentences, this woman's life is completely flipped. Because do you notice what he called her there? Daughter. Daughter. This woman who had been completely avoided, who had a label for life for 12 years, who had been kicked out and who had been kept out, forever unclean, Jesus calls her his child. And this is the only recorded time in history when Jesus directs that word or that title toward a person in the entire Bible. It's there in both the Mark and the Luke accounts, but this is the only story. You see, this bleeding woman was the most unlikely candidate to receive such a new and powerful label. In one word, daughter. Her identity changed, and all of a sudden she saw herself differently. I mean, when Jesus said, "Go in peace and be freed from your suffering," yes, the woman was physically healed. She stopped bleeding, but Jesus was referring to far more than just her physical suffering. He was referring to her story. He saw a woman whose labels caused her a whole lot of pain. She'd been there living under the opinions and the judgment of other people for years, and she was suffering because of it. And yet she reached out in faith. She reached out in the promise of God over her. And in trust and in doing so, Jesus gave her a new label. One that freed her from being the victim of everyone else's labels. One that freed her from being a victim of her own labels. I've tried everything and I'm unhealable. Because in that moment, Jesus invited her to let him decide who she was. It's like everyone else can have an opinion. Everyone else can give you but in this moment, I'm going to give you the opportunity to let me decide who you are. And he calls her daughter. You see, there's a label that beats all other labels, and that's his. His. We are his. You are his son. You are his daughter. You see, even in the story, usually the impure defiles the pure. But again, it's flipped. In this case, the opposite happened. His identity infected hers. You see, labels are temporary, they are small picture, certainly the ones that we give each other. We make decisions about ourselves and we make decisions about other people all the time and without all the information, and yet God is the only one who sees everything. And that's why there's a label that beats all other labels, and that's His. That's why it's the only label that actually matters. And so, like this woman, you may be still wary of the labels that you carry. Like the woman in the story, many of you would have not only received labels, but given yourselves labels. And so easily we can become trapped by them. We can be trapped in a society of gimmicks, being defined by the labels given to us, being shaped by them, having our decisions informed by them. But today I want you to walk away, shall I say, if you find yourself in that position with your identity flipped, the same way this woman did. But it starts by asking ourselves two very big questions. First of all, who gets to label you? Who gets to label you? We need to decide who gets to define us. We've got to pay attention to our words. What kind of things are we saying about ourselves? What kind of things are we believing about ourselves? If suddenly you feel like a label enters your mind, don't ignore it. Ask the question, is this true? What's God's perspective? Or is it a temporary label based only on what I can see? I mean, while I'm bombarding you with more questions, here's a few more. Are you allowing your past to define you? What kind of labels are you carrying from your past that just keep sticking? Are you being defined by your relationships or by your achievements or by other people? Or are you, like this woman, going to allow Jesus to be the one who defines you? Are you going to look to Him for who you are? Can I encourage you to allow His word over you to be the final word? Because there's no other label that beats the label of His. So, who gets to label you is the first question, but hey, let's just take that position of Wemmix for a second. Who gets to label them, the other people? Because even in that story, there's a whole bunch of a crowd who would have labeled that woman a particular way, and we need to be careful as followers of Jesus that we don't get caught in the habit of label making. You see, because when we look at other people, we get tempted to look toward people through this kind of filter of a particular label. Perhaps even in your mind, maybe not verbalize it, but you may look at people and you consider them as unclean or unimportant or unlovable. You might see others as rich or popular or powerful. And most of the time we don't even know we're doing it. We just do it, right? But most people, once they've kind of established these labels, allow that to determine the way that they treat those people. And it's like the label comes with a sense of worth. Stars and spots. And if we're not careful, we'll allow that label to determine someone's worth. And it's just not what Jesus has in mind for His followers. It's not what Jesus desires that we imitate. There's always a risk that we, unless we're careful, end up mistreating some of the people that Jesus paid the most attention to. Yeah? So what would it look like if we allowed Jesus to lead the way? What if we allowed Him to place His label on our friends or our children or our family or our work colleagues? If we allowed Him to place His label on them, the question is then, will we treat them accordingly? Will we treat them in light of how God sees them? Because like you, Jesus calls them His sons and His daughters. And the label is permanent and trumps every other label. And so as we wrap up, with whatever labels you carry, maybe today you feel like you need to approach Jesus from behind. like this woman. It's like, I know I'm carrying the labels, I know I'm carrying the history, I know these words have been spoken over me, and I just can't shake them. May you approach Jesus from behind with whatever courage you can muster and reach out to his tassels. Like, reach out to his healing power. Reach out to the promises that he has placed there from the beginning, that he wants us in faith to reach out toward. We might touch the tsetse with fear and with trembling, but you need to know that just like this woman, he will feel that touch. He will stop, and he will grant you the label that beats all other labels, and that is his. You are his. Let me pray. And Jesus, we take this moment to consider the labels that we carry. And Jesus, we may have tried to shake them. We may have tried to do things to generate a counter label. There are labels that we've simply complied with, even though they're not consistent with who we are. But God, we don't want the labels of this world to be ruling our lives and our identity. And so, God, would we have the courage to reach out to you, knowing that unlike this world, and even unlike the broken human condition, God, that in you we find the label that beats all other labels, and that is that you don't make mistakes. That we are sons and we are daughters. That the people around us are sons and daughters, your sons and daughters. And so, God, we surrender these labels to you. That you might speak loudly over our past and over our future. That we might approach you on a regular basis and maybe, just maybe, believe what it is that you say about us, about who you say we are. May the stickers fall. Amen. I invite Kate and the team to come up. We're going to close with a song.